Hi there, so welcome to the Lotions and Potions with the Concrete Gardens. The thing that we're going to be looking at today is one of several plants that you can still forage pretty much 12 months of the year. So right into November, December, January, February, right until March. You may recognise it. This is the top part, which is not the bit that we're going to be using, but it's good for identification. This is Dandelion. So Dandelion Taraxacum officinale. It's probably a plant that everybody's familiar with. But if you're not, if you're coming across kind of leaves around the place and you're wondering, is that dandelion or not? There's two really key ways to tell that. I'm trying to find a good example here. So the leaf is a real indicator. And the leaf in a dandelion has these really, really, really obvious like indentations. And that's from the name actually, because the French dandelion is Dandelion. So these are lion's teeth. So that's a really good way to identify it. And as you can see from these ones that have just been picked, the leaves always sit in this sort of rosette formation. And if they do happen to still have flowers in the winter, it'll be a single stem with one flower on it. So there's quite a lot of wild plants that look a little bit like dandelion and are probably cousins of dandelion. And a lot of them have multiple stems coming off with lots of different yellow flowers. Though some of those are also edible and medicinal, but they're not dandelion and they're not as medicinal as dandelion. So the part of the dandelion that we're looking at today is the root. And anyone who's ever tried to weed dandelions out will know that they grow back from the tiniest scrap of root ever. So you often get them like this, where there's kind of bits of root coming off other bits, and this one has two separate rosettes on it, which you kind of see here, because one's kind of grown at another time. So somebody has probably tried to weed this, and it hasn't quite worked. So the root, the best time to harvest the root are in the autumn and early winter, and in the early spring. It's quite a different thing at each time of year. So in the autumn and in the early winter, it is much sweeter. And that sweetness is because of the starches that the plant stores over the winter. And then by the time we get to spring, those starches have been used up and the dandelion has become more bitter. And it's good to use both of those properties. So at the moment, we're going to make it into dandelion coffee. And that we probably would prefer that slightly sweeter because it just tastes slightly nicer to drink it as a regular drink. But in the spring, it's also good to harvest the dandelion root because you can then use it more medicinally. So you could infuse it in a vinegar or make a tincture with it, and that pulls out those bitter properties, which are part of the medicinal quality of the actual dandelion root. So dandelion root in particular is very good for your digestive system in terms of helping. It's got a slightly laxative character to it, so it helps you go to the toilet. It's in no way kind of quick in doing that. It's not some sort of massively purgative thing, as we would call it, but it does help to create a regularity. It's also high in a lot of minerals and vitamins, and there's been some research recently looking at using dandelion root for benign prostatic hypertrophy, which is a type of prostate kind of tumour that is not cancerous, but it's very good for that. So what you do with your dandelion root is you dig it up. We've given these a bit of a clean, so if you want to use them fresh, what you can do is just kind of wash them, and then you've got these kind of nice clean dandelion root that you can use. If you're wanting to dry them to make a coffee, what you do is let them sit for a little bit longer. So I've got these ones here that have been sitting. I took most of the mud off them at first, but then I've let them sit. And then what you do with them is you just rub all the rest of the dried mud off and then chop these ones up to prepare them. So I'll show you what we do to make the coffee first of all. So we take these ones that have taken quite a lot of the mud off these, and these are a little bit dry already. And then you can some of them will break in the smaller ones, or you chop them like this into like smallish pieces. And again, this one's a slightly bigger one. So chop it up. And then you basically get a load of these and you put them in a low oven, so say about 30 degrees for a few hours until they're dry. And when they're dry, they're like these little bits here. So you can use these to make just a dandelion drink, just as they are. If you're going to do that, what you would want to do is heat the water that they're in. So put them on a stove, and I'll show you how to do this with the fresh ones in a moment, but you put them in water and then put heat under the water, and that's what you often need to do with roots to try and get some of the stuff out of them, because as you can see, they're pretty chunky, they're pretty solid. If you have one You can use a spice grinder or a coffee bean grinder, which is what I've done, and make it down into this kind of fine powder. And then if you want to make that into a drink, probably the easiest thing to do is get a little sieve or strainer, ideally put some muslin in it, or what you can do is actually wrap some of the dandelion coffee in the muslin. But if you do it like this, and basically put some of your coffee on there, and then put on our boiling water. And like that. And then what you can do is take the muslin like this, pop it in the water, leave a little bit over the side so that it doesn't, you can just attach that with a bit of string if you're happier with that, and then put something over the top. Like if you've got a lid for your cup, great, but I'm just using a saucer. And then you leave that for 10, 15 minutes, take out the muslin, and what you have when you're finished with is this sort of quite rich coffee. It is really quite sweet at this time of year, so that's a really nice sweet. So that's one way of making it, is to use the powder. So the other way is to use your either fresh or dried solid root and to make a decoction. So to make a decoction, you need a saucepan or something you can put on the heat, which has either a lid, or if you've got a plate or something that you can use to cover it, obviously something that's heat resistant. So I'm going to just put that on the side for now. So I'm going to take about half of this root for a mug of tea, and then just chop that up. So this is fresh, so this will last, and the actual roots would last if you keep them in a cool place, out of direct light. You should treat them the way that you would any root vegetable. So however it is you look after your carrots, that's how you could look after your dandelion root. It's very much the same idea. So I know that 2 goes of that is about a mug. So I'm just going to put that on the heat. I actually add a little bit more in as well, just to get it nice and strong. Go. And you just heat that for 10, 15 minutes with the lid on. You want it to be at a decent heat, but it doesn't need to boil. Just keep it kind of constant going there. And that's going to pull out all of the kind of substances in there that are a little bit more embedded because it's a root. And I've got a wee example here. This is one that I did earlier on, and I left the roots in this one, but you can see it's a lighter colour, and it's a kind of finer, I suppose, drink than the powdered one. But flavour-wise, it's definitely lighter than the powdered, but it's also maybe a nice way to get people into drinking something like dandelion tea that they might not be familiar with, so it's not quite as strong. So this is just boiling away here. And then after the 10-15 minutes, we'll take that off, just turn that down a wee bit. And so that'll be ready to go in about 10 minutes. You might want to leave it to cool a little bit before having it. You can, again, if you're having it like this, you can use your strainer again, just to make that work a little bit more easily. And if, like I say, if you're wanting to store your dandelion, you need to dry it a little bit to get going. But yeah, that's how we can make dandelion tea and dandelion coffee. We're going to look at making a minty foot scrub. So it's a 2-stage process. It takes a little bit of a while, but it's actually, all of the bits are really, really simple and really straightforward. And it's also something that you can use to make other scrubs with different things as well. So mint we're using today is peppermint, Mentha X Piperita. It's a regular mint that you'll have had in mint tea. Now we're using it as an external, as a kind of foot scrub. Peppermint foot scrubs are a really common thing that you see at a lot of places. And one of the reasons for that is that it's very good at deodorizing and absorbing smells. And some people do have smelly feet. So this is the peppermint. So you'll be getting it like this, a very kind of finely grained peppermint. I've got a slightly thicker one here that's just slightly bigger flakes. So we're going to crush that up a little bit as well when we're putting it in. So what we need to do, the first stage in making the peppermint foot scrub, is to make an infused oil. Now there's 2 main ways to make an infused oil, a kind of longer method and a shorter method. The longer method is tricky in Scotland in the winter, so we're going to do the shorter method. But if you wanted to try this at another time of year, the longer method is that you put mint and oil into a jar, the dried mint and oil into a jar, or in the summer you can use fresh mint, but not so much of it, and then put that in a sunny place, in a sunny windowsill for a couple of weeks, until the mint is all infused out into the oil. And you try and make sure, need to make sure that the mint stays under the surface of the oil at all times, because when we're making infused oils, it's a slightly technical process, and the one thing that you risk is that things can go mouldy, and that's if there's too much moisture in the system, or if the plant material gets exposed to too much air. You're not going to accidentally use mouldy oil, because you will really know about it, it will really smell. So if you are going to use a longer method for extracting things in oils, then do keep an eye on them. If you can, create something to kind of keep the plant material below the level of the oil. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to get our container and we're going to fill it with, say, kind of 1/3 to halfway up with the mint. So I've got this stuff here, and I'm just going to so this is a 150ml container, so you're probably looking at approximately 50 grams of mint. So if you want to do it more technically, you can weigh it, obviously tare it so that it goes back to 0. And then I'm just going to see, this is what's 1/3 of this look like. Now this is quite fine, so we're not looking at anywhere near 50 in this one. So that's not quite 1/3 yet. So we're going to be looking at taking up 50 mils of space with about 10 grams of mint there. So we're talking about 1/3 to 1/2 of that. So we then take our oil, and I just standard, this is sunflower oil, or a vegetable oil is fine. What you don't need to use is any kind of fancy oils like olive oil or anything like that. So what you do with this is you pour the oil on really, like nice and slowly. You want the oil to be absorbing into the mint as it goes on. So just a slow, steady pour. And if you get that just right, what often happens is most of the mint gets soaked with oil before the oil rises up, and so everything stays quite near to the bottom. So if you were going to use the long method, which is the method involving leaving it on a sunny windowsill when you have one, you want to be really, really, really careful about trying to soak in as much as the oil into the mint as possible. And that is easier when you're using a dried mint, so with a fresh you've got to be even more careful. So we're just putting that lid on loosely. That's to keep the essential oils in there whilst we're heating it, because we're going to warm this in a bain-marie, which is a warm water bath, for like several hours. 2 hours minimum. You might want to go up to kind of 4 to 6 hours if you can. You can also do this in a slow cooker, which is a little bit easier for you to kind of leave the house and go away from it, because you're not leaving a hob on. So to do your bain-marie, what we have here is a saucepan, and in the base of the saucepan we've got a saucer that just fits snugly in. And that saucer then acts as a base for our glass jar, and it stops it from rattling about on the bottom of the saucepan and potentially spilling, and it also stops it from getting too heated up from the base of the saucepan, depending on the heat source that you're using. So I'm going to cheat a little bit and start with some boiled water. And with a pan this size, I'm going to fill the pan fairly high up. You want the water to come up, certainly not to the very top of your jar, because there's a risk that it might come in through the top and you end up, as I said, water is the thing you don't want in your system. So take a little bit more than that. But you do want it to come some of the way up the jar. Another good thing about doing this in the glass jar is the lid keeps some of the heat in as well, so the stuff's infusing out more quickly. So I'm going to place this on here. There we go. I could take even a little bit more actually. So you can hear the saucers kind of moving about in there a wee bit, but once that gets settled, that'll be fine. So we put the jar on top there, and then we're going to put that onto the gas. So we're going to have this on a really gentle heat. We don't want this bubbling at all, because obviously then you might knock your jar, you might end up with like knocking water around the place. The lid here is only on loosely because you don't want to create too much of a seal, but equally might come off. So we have that on basically the very lowest heat we can manage. And if you start to see any little bubbles forming, a good thing is if you're sort of in your kitchen or about the house and you've left this to go for a couple of hours, because the saucer's in the bottom there, you will hear if any bubbles form because the saucer starts to clatter a little bit. So it is quite a useful thing to have on lots of levels for making this with the bain-marie. So we're going to leave that for a few hours, and then we're going to pour off through a muslin in a little sieve, pour the oil through into another jar, and then you can discard the oily mint. You might want to put that in compost, probably the council compost, because oil isn't created in a personal compost. And then we're going to use that oil to make the foot scrub. So making our foot scrub, so it's easiest to do this if you have a kind of decent sized bowl. We've got here, so this is some mint oil that we've made from the infused mint. And we're going to mix it with some salt. This is slightly coarser grain salt than pouring salt, but pouring salt would work as well. But this is, and I just quite like this because it's pink as well. So if we're going to put this into a jar like the jars that you've got whenever we're finished, to make a kind of little jar of foot scrub, and you can decant that into little smaller containers if you want to as well. They make quite nice presents if you want to make them look fancy. The way to do this is to add the oil very gradually to the sugar. So we want a roughly 50-50 amount of oil and sugar, or oil and salt. We're working on the assumption that that salt is relatively dense. So we've got this amount of salt. So if we were to put this into the jar and see what that looks like, we want about half. So that's pretty much about right. That's about half. So we're just going to pop this in the bowl. Got some clumpy bits, but that's fine. And then we just slowly add the oil. So you just add a dribble of it, like that. And then we just mix that to combine it and just get it to absorb in. And as you go along, so at this stage, I've got some clumpy bits in it, but there's still some of the oil, space for more oil, because some of the salt hasn't absorbed all the oil. So have another pour, and and the salt kind of brings out the smell of the mint a little bit as well, so you get a really, really lovely scent from this too. So at this stage I've got it at the minute, with a little bit of mixing, that'll be well combined, and that there's no kind of excess salt still around. To my mind, I would add a little bit more oil to that, just to give it a little bit more of a consistency, but you absolutely could use it as it is at the minute. In fact, I'm just getting the pink salt has its own scent to it as well, so I'm just going to get a tiny, tiny little bit more, just to get it the consistency that I like it. But there's quite a lot of kind of stages along the way. What you don't really want is there to be lots of like salt sitting on its own, not combined, or oil not combined. And then we would transfer this to our jar, and then we've got the salt scrub. And this is just really good for kind of dry feet. The salt has lots of kind of micronutrients and things in it, which are really good for your skin. And minty oil helps with the deodorizing. And if you do just be aware if you have any cracked skin, maybe not to use this on areas that are like particularly raw, because the salt could be a little bit irritating. But you could also put this, if you're feeling like really kind of treating yourself, put this into a basin of hot water and make a foot bath with your mint foot scrub actually in the water. And that gives you the kind of oiliness, but also you get that sort of Epsom salt bath kind of thing. So that's this done. So you just label that up as your minty foot scrub.